Sensei Morris share this paragraph. Periodically, the Pew Research Center does a study of America's religious beliefs and practices. One of the fastest growing segments of the population includes those who identify as spiritual but not religious. But what does it mean to be spiritual as opposed to being religious? Is it possible to be spiritual, religious, and even faithful and still be rational? In his talk, we'll discuss faith, religion, and spirituality, how they relate to one another, and how to live a life of spiritual wellness. And now I'd like to give you a little bio on our speaker today, Morris Doshin Sullivan. We call him Sensei Morris. And he is a Zen monk, ordained in the Soto school, and also a recognized Dharma teacher in multiple Buddhist traditions. He is the spiritual head of Volusia Buddhist Fellowship in DeLand, which is where I met him, and the Leadership Council president of Bright Dawn, a Buddhist seminary program. While in Florida, Sensei Morris was a regular lecturer at White Sands Buddhist Center, a Vietnamese monastery on the Space Coast. And if you haven't visited there, it's a beautiful place. I recommend it. And Sensei Morris also led Buddhist services at Tomoka Correctional Institution, was the chaplain at Stetson University, and spoke regularly to several Unitarian Universalist congregations. Sensei Morris holds a certificate in methods of Japanese psychology, which employs practices drawn from Japanese Zen and Shin Buddhism for personal and spiritual growth. He first became interested in Buddhism as a teenager when he began reading about Zen, and has authored and contributed himself to several books on Buddhist practice. He now lives in Massachusetts with his wife Michelle and their dog Diogenes. He leads a meditation group and serves on the worship committee of a UU church that was founded by Puritans in 1630. Let us now welcome Sensei Morris.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, and happy Mother's Day from me also. You know, in the Buddhist faith tradition, we say that all beings have at some time been our mothers. And so if you're a mother today, or were a mother in some previous existence, or will be one in a future existence, or you just nurture the health and well-being of others in some way, then happy Mother's Day to you. Well, when we started talking about me joining you virtually today, this idea came up of talking about religion and spirituality, and these topics come up quite a bit in conversations with me, and I decided I would throw faith into the mix also, and maybe even words like divine and deity and stuff like that. So I want to preface all this by saying I'm not going to try to sell you my point of view. You don't have to agree with me. In fact, it's probably best if you don't. You know, we find our own wisdom. But I hope that I can give you some ideas about how principles embodied in these concepts like faith and spirituality and religion might be useful to you in your own life and on your own journey. So, like some of you probably, I was raised in a different tradition. I grew up Baptist, and I often hear from people who were traumatized or even see themselves as victimized by their religious upbringing. I didn't have that experience, but when I was in my early teens, I realized that my feelings about things like war and civil rights were very different from the views that I encountered in church on Sundays. And so I stopped going to church on Sundays. But I was still interested in religion as well as meditation and things like that. And so now I'm a Zen Buddhist monk, and as Chris said, I serve on the worship committee of a UU church in New England. And that church is a good example of some things that we encounter when we try to talk about faith and spirituality and religion. So it was established in 1630 and has gone through a bunch of different buildings since then, but the institution has remained constant. If a bunch of us went there and looked at the building today, I'm pretty sure that we'd all recognize it as a church. And I think a lot of us would agree if we sat in that building on a Sunday morning that there was a religious service going on. And yet, if we asked the people at the service afterward if they were religious, probably a lot of them would say no. And some would probably say, nah, I'm really just more spiritual. And if we started asking people there, please explain your faith to me, I don't know that any two of them would agree on what that means. So, if we're going to discuss religion and spirituality and faith in any meaningful way and to any constructive end, we probably should try to agree on what those words mean. But unfortunately, that's just not that easy. I think it's an important thing to do because if we have healthy relationships to these things in our life, it positively impacts our overall physical and mental well-being, and also just the way we live in the world and our relationships with others. So let's try to nail down what we mean when we say spirituality. I saw a study of religious plurality recently, and there were several researchers, and they had found more than 24 distinctly different definitions of spirituality. So it's not universally accepted at all. But the root are in the Latin word spiritus, so spirit, which referred to what we might call a soul, but also things like ghosts and qualities like courage. It's also related to the Latin word that means to breathe. And in early Judaism, the spirit referred pretty specifically to breath. You probably know the story in Genesis where God breathes life into Adam. And so that's spirit. The concept of a soul originated with the Greeks, but some traditions, Buddhism included, and many humanists and so on, don't think of a soul as a separate, discrete, sort of eternal entity that's the seat of the self. Well, given all that, what does it mean to be spiritual? If somebody says, I'm spiritual but not religious, what does this mean? Just to live a spiritual life is probably a more accurate way of looking at it. So I'm going to talk about this in Buddhist terms mainly because that's what I do best. So in Buddhism, we see the self as made up of form and mind. There are elements like carbon, oxygen, and water in form, and also energy like combustion in our cells and things like that. And then we have mind, which is made up of things that we can't see or weigh or measure: feelings, perceptions, cognitions, consciousness. None of those things individually is spirit. But you might say that there are areas where those things affect one another. There are mental activities that have a positive effect on the body, and physical activities that have a positive effect on the mind. So, for instance, if you meditate on the breath, you calm the mind and you relax the body. You'll experience that as a result of calming the breath, which is a physical process. But it also seems that some kinds of meditation, cultivating compassion, for example, affect the parasympathetic nervous system in ways that may positively influence heart health and that sort of thing. So I think you could say that spirituality, spiritual practices, are things that focus on the intersection of mind and body in ways that benefit both. Also, people who have a good sense of well-being tend to have a strong sense of purpose. And so we could consider that a spiritual element. Good connections to human beings, a feeling of being part of something bigger than themselves. And we might talk about that something bigger in terms of awe, which arises when we perceive something as divine or sacred, even if it's not specifically associated with a deity. So when we see something that helps us realize that there's something bigger, that's something that transcends my ego's concerns, but that includes me and even embraces me, that's a pretty high quality spiritual experience. Those things can come about as a result of religious activity. But in some cases, I think religion can get in the way of spiritual development if it's misunderstood or misused. And the Buddha recognized this. He once spoke with a group of people called the Kalamas. They had heard from different gurus, these guys who would travel around going from place to place and talking. And these guys would contradict each other about things like life after death and whether there's anything after you die and whether what you do in this life has any effect on what comes afterward and that kind of stuff. And the Kalamas wanted to know how to tell if a teaching was true or not. They heard all these things, they were all different. What do we follow? Well, the Buddha, you might assume that the Buddha would say, well, if I say it, you should assume it's true. But that's not what he did. In fact, he started out by saying, don't assume that a teaching is true because it's your tradition. Don't assume a teaching is true because it's what the holy books say, or because this teacher is my teacher, and all those kinds of things. In other words, he said, don't believe something just because a religious authority says it's true. Instead, he said, try it and see if the teaching benefits yourself and others. And if it does, you consider it true. And he suggested that they develop metta, as the Metta Sutra, goodwill, and also compassion, appreciation, equanimity. And then he said, if goodness cultivated in this life leads to a better rebirth, then you're better off in the next life. And if not, you have a better life in the here and now. Now, that doesn't mean religion is a bad thing. It can provide a framework for developing healthy spirituality, creating community, skillfulness, values, things like that. So we should probably look at what we mean when we say religion. Again, there's not a universally accepted definition of it. In some places, it's defined as worship of a deity, but that's seeing it through a pretty narrow lens, one that generally comes from the Western Abrahamic tradition. And that's also where we get the idea, by the way, that you can only have one religion at a time. That's not universally considered true at all either. But a lot of religions are not theistic. A religion is not necessarily a system of beliefs, and most of them don't insist on exclusivity. Religions can take many different forms. There's usually a mythology of some sort, a set of stories that helps convey the main religious principles, values, ethics. And there's a community, a group of people who practice together, who share the values reflected in those principles. And then there's a soteriology. That's a big word that means theory of salvation. It's sort of the objective of a religion. It might be going to heaven. It might be transcending samsara, the cycle of suffering and coming and going. Or it could be the betterment of humanity and the other beings that we share the planet with. So there's a saying, all paths lead to the top of the mountain. So religions, generally, there's a path, there's a mountaintop, or at least there's a way out of the valley of the shadow, if you prefer. So I was once invited by a hospital chaplain to talk to a group of medical professionals about Buddhism. And the chaplain, a Christian, asked me, he said, what do you think is the biggest difference between Buddhism and Christianity? Well, in response, I asked him, in as few words as possible, what is your religion? He said, well, we believe that God so loved the world that he gave his only son so that we might have everlasting life. So his religion then is based on this particular belief, and that's a statement of that belief. So I said, well, when the Buddha was asked to sum up his religion in a few words, he said, do good, avoid evil, purify your mind. That's the path to peace. So this is a statement of practice. So in some religions, the ones that we usually think about, salvation of some form comes mainly via correct belief, orthodoxy, correct belief. In others, religion comes about mainly through right practice, orthopraxy. So if you feel aversion to the idea of religion, just remember you can be religious and not be bound up in beliefs. You can focus on practice. Buddhism, by the way, is primarily orthopraxical. It's mostly about what you do. So this brings us to the idea of faith. It's another troublesome word for a lot of people. So we live with faith all the time. Getting in my car is an act of faith. Getting into an airplane and expecting it to take me through the sky to someplace else. That's an act of faith. So why do we have a hard time with faith in the divine or in religion? I suspect a lot of it is because many of us feel we have been misled in the past. Or maybe we were led in faith by people who didn't really understand faith very well, or whose own faith hadn't developed all that fully. I can't remember which theologian I was reading, but I came across something about faith in a book recently, and I think it might have been by Father Richard Rohr, who's a priest who works a lot with contemplative practices. And he was talking about how at one time the church saw faith really more in terms of doing than believing. So if you were a Christian, believing in Jesus wasn't all that important. The faithful embodied the teachings. When I was a chaplain at Stetson, the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life decided that we would try to program some things in a way that would help students develop spiritual wellness by progressing to higher levels of faith. And we used as our framework the stages of faith that were identified by James W. Fowler. He was a Christian theologian and developmental psychologist. And Fowler looked at faith the way psychologists study other kinds of development from birth into adulthood, and he identified several stages. So at first, children develop an ability to trust, to love, to have hope, things like that. So in early childhood, that comes about mainly from their relationship with their parents and other caregivers. Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, who many of you probably have heard of, he talked about that in a famous Mother's Day talk. He said it's because of experiencing love from our mothers and our love for our mothers that we learn about love of all kinds. Later on, children adopt impressions from things like religious stories, rituals that their parents and other people in their immediate community do. And then our awareness expands beyond that to include things like scripture and ritual. And our faith tends to become more about conforming to social norms. Around that stage, we start to realize other people have different beliefs, and we tend to identify strongly with our own faith. So a lot of people get to that point, which usually happens somewhere in the school years, and don't go beyond it. We continue to see our own faith as the one true faith and that kind of thing. But some people start to question our assumptions about faith and religious authorities. You see that a lot in college students who, suddenly they're in a different environment, and so they start to wonder if what they were brought up with is the truth. Some people walk away from faith and religion altogether at that point, but others will take responsibility for their own faith development, and they find that they can let go of some of their assumptions about things and some of their traditions, and they can hang on to others. Well, if you're a UU, the next stage of faith is actually included in the principles. At that stage, we're more open to others' faith perspectives, and we can accept that there are going to be mysteries, questions we can't answer, that sort of thing. And we recognize the greater importance of community as an element of faith. Well, Fowler identified ultimately what he called universalizing faith. This is where you find teachers like the great Zen masters or Reverend Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, and so on. He called this enlightenment. So enlightenment is still a stage of faith, but in it one has transcended the need for existing religious systems and lives a life guided by universal principles like wisdom and compassion. And someone with that level of faith can recognize enlightenment in others, regardless of religious tradition. So enlightenment is kind of a faith beyond faith. So if you feel a little inner cringe when you hear a word like faith, it could be that you equate faith with blind adherence to what you've been told. But in Buddhism, we see faith as a process. When you encounter a teacher or a teaching, first make sure that the teacher is someone who knows something that you want to learn. And then listen to or read carefully what is being said. You make sure you understand it, but especially understand how it applies to you. How can you put this teaching to use in your own life? And then embody that teaching with your actions. That's how you reap its fruits. You benefit from it by living a better life, by moving closer to that stage of faith that Fowler talked about. So you can go to church and say prayers and read holy books and not reap any of the fruits of religion. You can buy singing bowls or crystals or burn incense and all that kind of stuff and not become spiritually any healthier. And to uncritically adhere to dogma is not faith. To reap the fruits of those things, you have to walk the path. So, for example, I mentioned this Buddhist idea that because of birth and rebirth, we have all been one another's mother at some point. And again, the idea is we might not have been human at the time. We may have been dogs or spiders or even some sort of formless being in a non-human realm. But at some point, everyone around you has given you life. Well, to make that idea useful, you need to have faith. Now, does that mean that you have to believe it's literally true? No, you could, but you're not going to be able to validate it by evidence like some kind of science experiment. So how do you reap the fruit of the teaching? You live with it. So, there's not a single atom in my body that I can say is separately and uniquely mine. Countless bits and pieces of my form have come and gone just since I started talking a few minutes ago. Even thoughts, feelings, and that kind of stuff are not really mine to possess and control. And the same is true of you. In fact, I used to live in Florida, so there's a probability that some of my atoms used to belong to you and vice versa. So are we all one another's mothers in a literal sense? Well, if we can use faith in that concept, to let go of clinging to a sense of me that's somehow separate from and more important than the other me's out there, then we can come to live with more compassion and more wisdom. We can realize something that's very profound, that we truly live together in oneness. We truly owe our lives to each other. So again, happy Mother's Day, and thank you for your attention.